Absolutely.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So today we are going to be talking about building aligned design systems. There's a lot of different elements to this. We're going to talk about this at the high level. We're going to go deep into into different areas, talk about how Figma can really help to ensure that you've got some good foundations in place and why those are important, how to build and grow that system. And probably one of the newer, more exciting areas that I think folks are really interested in is how do we align this for code connectivity? And what does that mean when we start talking about aligning and working with our development partners as well as AI tooling, agentic coding tools, and things like that. So this is a big topic. There is a lot for us to cover. We will do our best. We're going to have resources dropped into the channel for you as well. So if you need to, if you want to have additional conversations or discussions or things like that, if you've got questions, please drop them in the Q&A. If you want to chat in the webinar chat, that's great too, but please make sure those questions are in Q&A because that's where we're going to be looking for them as well. All right, and with that, let's go ahead and kick off for our content. So we are going to be talking about building design systems together. If anyone watched Config earlier this year from San Francisco, there was a great talk on stage called Building Design Systems Together. This was from a couple of our other advocates, Chad Bergman and Jake Albaugh. I highly recommend you go and watch that talk. This is going to be sort of an extension and a little bit of a summary of some of the things that they were discussing there as well. But we're also going to talk about some of the newer pieces that have arrived since that discussion as well. But if you have a chance to go check out that video, it's fantastic. You can just Google Figma config building design systems, and you'll find another great talk to go give you more information for as well. Everyone is somewhere on their design systems journey, right? And so you often think about, okay, we want to be building, we build these really beautiful design systems in Figma. We have a lot of really great design work. And then when we get to working with development partners, sometimes things maybe don't go as smoothly as we want them to. I have had this happen to me as well. We have all of these great ideas that we want to build, but sometimes for practical reasons, maybe the same component has to get rebuilt multiple times because we're not using a shared design, development component, or there's gaps that are slowing the teams down in their understanding of each other's language between how they describe a particular color or they describe a particular component. And if that's something you experience, you are not alone. That is a very common problem that happens for lots of different teams. And the root of that problem is often that misalignment. And design and engineering are very different disciplines, but we can also benefit from having a shared source of truth and actually working off of those sources of truth. This is basically the concept of where design systems come into play, right? They offer us a shared space for consistent workflows, clarity on how we want to collaborate together, and drive a lot of confidence and consistency in the work that we're doing from both the code side and the design side as well. So let's walk through how we actually manage a lot of that inside of Figma, whether that's working with a series of features like our team libraries, components, variables, branching, Code Connect, and ultimately how that can help support developers and developers using tools like Figma MCP as well. So everyone's somewhere on their journey in the design systems alignment story. Whether you're just getting started or you've got a very mature system in place, the goals are going to be largely the same, right? We want to have that tighter alignment, less rework, faster execution. And the purpose of design systems in that sense is to help ensure that we have that scaffolding that keeps that product quality really, really high. And more than ever, design systems are really important because of this. We want to be moving faster. We want to have that alignment. And now we have additional tooling and other ways that we can really take advantage of all of the information that we've put into that design system as well, right? So they help us by having clear scaffolding. We can have a shared language that helps the designers explore their different designs but also having that clarity for engineering of what it is that they need to build. You can communicate intent without necessarily having to handhold on every single design, right? We can elevate concepts like how things should transition or what are some general ideas, right? Instead of having to explain that at every single part of our design, our system is there to help others understand that we've already aligned on some of those higher level principles, and we don't have to keep re-explaining ourselves every time they come up. And ultimately, that's really the goal. We want to make meaningful decisions repeatable. We want to be able to have all of that shared knowledge in that space. And kind of to that point, design systems aren't really optional these days. They're kind of a really important part. If you talk to a lot of larger organizations, you're going to see that they are very, very valuable and save a ton of time and resources in the long run. Now, if you're just getting started on a brand new project, you might be thinking about some of these principles. So the value is still there, even if you don't have a design system in place yet, because you're just at a much earlier stage in development. But you'll see quickly that those principles tend to apply everywhere. So we are going to go hands-on inside of Figma. We're going to look at some of this stuff today and talk about the tactical ways that you can take advantage of this inside of the Figma product today. And the first place we're going to start is with variables. So I think it's time for a demo. Okay, let's make this UI a little bit bigger. This is usually bigger than how I generally work, but hopefully it'll be easier for you all to see what we're doing here today. And we're going to talk about, we're going to start with variables. Now, this is not going to be a talk on variables. Again, we have tons of great resources. So if you want to go understand the different types of variables, how to create them, where you can find them, and watch like full sessions on this kind of stuff, there's tons of great content from Figma. But we're going to basically, just to sort of give you all a quick overview, variables are the way that we store values inside of our system to make them reusable, repeatable, and easy to change, right? If we store the value in one place and we're using the variable in other places, all we have to do is change the variable, and everywhere that we use it, it gets updated. Pretty straightforward. Inside of Figma, variables can be accessed from the variables panel. Here we're looking at a design file. Generally speaking, when you're working with design systems, your variables are actually going to be in your team library, in your system file instead, right? So I actually have another file open here, which is the library itself. Right? It's still another Figma file, but a team library is basically a file that instead of having the actual design work, it has all the elements that make up our design and our system in that place. So we've got typography, we've got our colors, our logos. You'll notice we've got pages with all of our different components on it too as well, right? This is published, shared out to our design team, and then anyone working on their design files has access to that library and can pull in those elements. So back in our library file, we'll go back to our foundations page where we have all of our colors. All of this has been defined as variables inside of the design system. If I go to the variables panel here, you'll see that we have all of those different colors that are defined inside of this collection called colors. So variables start with collections. Again, if you want to learn all of the real basics, there's some great tutorials. You can go to help.figma.com on that kind of stuff. But just to talk through some good best practices here, you'll notice I have 3 collections inside of this file, one for color, one for spacing, and one for typography. Inside each of these collections, we're going to have different types of variables for different use cases. It's not always the same variable type. For example, typography has both text variables and size variables and things like that, but they're grouped by what they're used for. Right? This is a really helpful way to just keep things organized and make sure that you're finding what you're looking for quickly. Color refers to everything that we're using where we have a color applied, whether this is default colors or we have maybe multiple brands, or we want to show different modes like light and dark mode, right? This is where we put all of those types of things. Spacing, this is our general units that we use in different ways in our design to define things like paddings or margins or white space between typography, things like that, right? These are our core units. I know this can be a really big debate between teams too as well. Like, what's your core actual unit? Is it 8 pixels? Maybe you can go really rogue and do a 7 pixel, something like that. 8 tends to be a pretty common one I see across the board. And lastly, typography variables, right? So this is where, 7 pixels exactly. So this is where I'm giving designers a real heart attack right now. So this is where we have some of our typography variables that are defined, right? So we've got our typeface names, our font sizes, our what we call our font ramp or our font scale here, right? Where we have our different sizes that we're using regularly. And so these collections make it easy to keep those things organized. One thing you'll notice is that these collections are not extensive. Like there's not a collection for every brand, right? Or if I'm working with multiple brands, or there's not collections that for every possible thing. I'm trying to keep these pretty organized and just have very simple ones. The reason being is that these surface back in your design through different panels that you can use to sort of grab those values, right? So basically, if I go to a design element over here and I want to actually like search for a particular color or something like that, if let's go ahead and grab like palette black. These libraries, so in this case, you can see I have the Colab library applied here, right? So if I go to that library, those collections are going to be available for you to basically see them here where they're going to show up inside of that inside of your panels. And if you have a ton of collections, it can just end up being a ton of drop downs. I'm going to mention one thing in particular, especially for teams working with multiple modes or brands, right? Modes are the concept where the same variable has different values depending on the mode, the context that's been applied. Let's just look at a quick example to help this make sense. If I go back to my design file over here, here I have my design. Up in the top right-hand corner next to our page, you can see I can set the current modes that are applied. Our color collection, again, remember, that's that color collection I was talking about, has two separate modes, light and dark mode. If I apply a dark mode, we're going to get all of those variables into our new dark mode theme. Really, really powerful, right? So if you are setting things like light and dark modes, this is a really great way to do that. Make sure they set them up as modes. If you have different, I'm sure some of you all have heard about some exciting things that are coming soon regarding the ability to extend collections and create really nice and complex multi-brand design systems. I'm excited for that. We're gonna have some really good content on that in the near future. But for now, if you have like, let's say 2 brands, you need light and dark, the best way to set these up is to have, say, brand 1 light, brand 1 dark, brand 2 light, brand 2 dark as modes within the same collection. That'll make it easier to extend those in the future as well. Cool. Couple more things on variables. Let's talk about naming conventions, right? So if I go back to our library over here, you'll notice that these colors are named, in an interesting way. It looks a little bit like kind of how a developer would do this, right? Everything's lowercase, there's no spaces. This is mainly so that a convention that came from programming, right? Spacing in program, putting spaces in names in programming can have interesting results. And so this is sort of an adopted trend that comes from the development side. And it's a skill that I really recommend, right? Always talking to your development partners, because there's a lot of things that come from development and code writing that are actually really good practices that have taken a long time to sort of understand why they are the way they are. And they can also be really valuable for designers too, right? They remove ambiguity and they make it easier for us to not have to worry about edge cases, right? If we've got spaces and capital letters and things like that in our naming conventions, that's a lot of things we have to make sure we get right every single time. Whereas if we just have simpler conventions of lowercase and dashes, sometimes called kebab case, these things just make it easier. You can, again, go very deep on this kind of naming conventions. There's a fantastic article about variable naming by Nathan Curtis from 8Shapes. That's a great one. I would check it out. We'll share some resources afterwards as well in the email with the video. And again, I just want to use this as like an example to say, like, if you're ever wondering what you should be naming something, or you're wondering how you should organize something, or things like that, talk to your development partners, right? They may have already gone through that process. They may have figured that out already. Cool. I'm going to pop the chat open here just so I can hate this. Yeah, they hate us. No, they don't hate you. They just want to, they want to work with you. They've got conventions already in place. And this is where you can really, extend that branch to the development partners and say, hey, I want to learn from you. I want to understand more. Okay. So I was talking about naming conventions, right? You can have your conventions here inside of Figma Design. As much as these can align with your actual development variables, that's fantastic. Now, if they can't, or you don't want to for whatever reason, you have other ways that you can go about this, which is you can actually, for every variable, if you want to, there is a section here called code syntax, meaning that this will actually display a different value for the variable that's used, because you may just want to display it for developers in the dev mode panel differently. So here, let's take our palette black that we have there, right? So we've got that real primary color that we have here. In fact, let's go to our colors. There we go. We're going to go to palette brand down here. And you can see we've got that primary color or that secondary color that we have applied. What I'm going to do is let's go ahead and just apply that primary color, right? So if I come back to our design file over here And I'm just going to create a little rectangle up here real quick, and I'm going to apply that fill. And we're going to go to our libraries. This is also just a really quick way to know how to apply this stuff. And let's go to all libraries. I'm just going to say primary, palette brand primary, right? We're in our light mode now. So that's what we're seeing here. This is basically that same color that we have in our variables that we saw right here, palette brand primary. That's where that actual color is being applied. But what's cool is you'll see here that we actually have a separate code syntax set for this, SDS color palette brand primary. That's a different naming convention than what we're actually using inside of Figma. Figma, we're just calling it primary because that's easy. That's all that we need. But our developers need the actual name of that token or that variable that they're using inside of code. So that little syntax window allows you to set that differently so that when a developer comes in and they're actually trying to get that color, let's say we go to CSS for our language, they're going to see that value, right? They're going to see the SDS color palette brand primary. They're not going to see that that word just primary that we had before there. It's actually the value that they're going to need. So a useful way to help build alignment in your design system when we're talking about variables. Cool. That was a fair amount on variables. We're going to keep moving because I want to get to some of our other areas here. I often get the question, this one comes up quite a bit. We have variables. Why would I still use styles? What's the purpose of styles over variables? Well, styles are older than variables. Figma has had styles for much longer. Styles set all of the information about a property or multiple properties, right? So for instance, it might have multiple fills or different typography settings. This is where styles still have a lot of value, right? So like, let's look at a piece of typography for a second. Here I have a piece of text. If I was to not use a style for this, I have all of these different typography properties, and I can set these to variables, which is great. So they will actually use our variables inside of our system. But if I want to set this to a different, heading style that I've already set or a different typography style, that's a lot of variables to have to change individually. By saving this as a style, it's taking all of those properties and making it easy for me to apply all of those variables at once, right? So you can kind of think of like styles are like a superset of different properties that can have variables applied and just apply them all at once very quickly. It would be really cool if that worked for every property, but only for certain things like typography, effects. You'll see this in other areas as well. And it's just a good shortcut for keeping your applying variables very quickly and by just simply applying the style. Cool. All right, let's keep moving. The last sort of big portion that I want to cover here, at least on like sort of the basics of your design system, is talking about components, right? So we talked about variables, the very primitive elements of our design system. We've talked about styles, which are sort of groupings of variables applied to properties. And let's go one level higher than this, which is components, right? The actual visual architecture of the elements that make up our designs, right? When we're building our designs, I'm going to put this back into light mode so it's a little bit easier for us to see. There we go. All of our different elements of our site are made up of components. These might be very molecular, very small, or sorry, very, very atomic in the sense of something like a button, right? That's usually just a couple of layers and some auto layout properties, things like that. Sometimes they can be more advanced, but for the most part, they're a very simple concept. And components may also make up much larger things like this entire header navigation or even an entire section of our page or an entire component area, right? Maybe you've got some templated spaces that make sense. The real power of components is that they can be instantiated. Once you have the main component, any instances of that will update automatically, right? I know this might be kind of basic for some folks, but it's good stuff to look at, right? So basically always good to remember, like if I have a main component like this, all of the instances will update when the main component updates, right? Main components can have variants as well. They can have additional variations that appear as options inside of the instance for anyone using that component, right? So this is basically where we can say, oh yeah, this should actually switch to a different variant whenever I need to use that. Perhaps you have different variant properties for different things like setting the state or changing the size or changing the actual text with a component property over here. And so this is basically the idea of creating a menu of options for downstream users of your design system, right? The whole purpose of component props and variant props and things like that is that you can simplify the experience for someone going to use your component, right? You're handing them that Lego kit of the design system of going, here's all the things I want you to use, and here's the properties that I've defined that you should be able to change, right? That's a real power of design systems, is that you're able to create what we sometimes call an AX, an authoring experience, where in this case, as a design system creator, my end user is not the actual user of my application. It's the person who's going to go design with the components I've created as part of that design system. So let's just give you, I want to give you a couple good best practices here just around components and things to be aware of. Let's talk about a component itself first, and then we'll talk about a little bit higher level organization aspects of it. So for starters, this is a complex component, right? Generally, if you're starting from scratch, a component's going to be rather simple. You might just have a couple of layers like this, like a button, and you're going to create this into a component. Let me turn on my shortcuts so y'all can see what I'm doing here. Great. Oh, Zoom won't let me show my shortcuts. That's okay. I'll just explain it. So Option Command K or Alt Control K on a PC, you can quickly create a new component. You can also right click and say create component. Lots of different ways that you can go about this. This is a very basic component. It doesn't have any properties, right? And if I wanted to edit this, I have to go in and edit the layers automatically. Same thing with the instance, right? If I have an instance of this, it's not gonna let me change anything, or nothing's been defined for me to change. Any change I make would have to be manual at the layer level, overriding the properties of the component. Once we start to add properties, this is where component properties, this is where you're sort of, again, creating that interface that other designers can actually use. So for instance, if I say, actually, I want this text to be able to be editable, I can go in and I can say, I want this to be a component prop. So what I can do is I can basically say, yes, this thing should be a component prop. I want to tie this. We'll do it the other way around, actually. I'm going to go to select the main component, say properties, say text, and I'm going to say, yeah, this should be the label of the button, right? And I can either choose to give it a value. I can also give it a value tied to a variable if I needed to. In this case, we're not going to tie it to a variable. We're just going to have it be self-contained. And so we're just going to say create property. And now, if I was to wire this up correctly, let's go ahead and actually add that text prop in here to our label in our button. I know I'm moving fast. Again, we have full videos on component props, so don't worry about that. This is mainly about the design system as a whole. That instance now has a label property, right? And no matter what I put in there, cats, that button's going to update, right? I've created that simpler interface for my designers. That concept is really powerful, but it can also be taken too far. And that's something to be aware of, right? Like we had something that happened when we released variants, which is that people were starting to create hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of variants that were occurring here. And it's a good idea. It's a good idea to like, you know, any good idea taken to its logical conclusion can be a bad idea, right? So it's like, cool, I created all of these variants, but it's an important thing to know about performance, and two types of performance. One is technical performance, right? If you have massive, massive variants that have, with hundreds of variants inside of them, all of these types of things, they are going to add to the memory inside your file. Every time you use them, that's going to increase memory, which can have an impact on performance. But also, there's just the mental overload. If you have hundreds and thousands of variants, you might be asking people to sift through a list that's incredibly long, which can be a much tougher experience for them as far as what they're looking for, right? So always just try to keep component props and variants under control. You can go in here, you can see that we've got variants for our different button states. So if we're changing colors, if we're doing things like that, if we want to show and hide elements, the best way to do that is with component properties. So here, our button looks kind of simple, but if you actually look under the hood, you'll see it's even got an icon. It's got an icon arrow option inside of it. I'll turn that on momentarily so you can see it. We're not using variants to hide and show that because we can use component props. Component props allow you to basically make changes without needing to create a whole nother set of variants. Something as simple as showing and hiding a layer should be much easier than needing to actually create a whole new set of buttons just to hide and show. And this is where you can basically turn that icon on and off using what's called a Boolean property, right? So these kinds of improvements can be really nice. If you ever find yourself saying, boy, this component has a lot of variants, or this component's getting really, really big, look at ways that you might be able to change those variant properties into Boolean properties or text properties where you don't have to create new variants for each one. You can just change the value by changing the component prop. Two other points here from a design system perspective that I think are really key. Making it's all about variants. Like making, I'm gonna go to some different components over here, but look at a card component, right? Like this card component's fairly simple. We've got four versions of this card because we have different image heights we want to set. Those are very specific as part of our grid system. So we want to give users the option to set that. Um, if I had other versions of this card, or if I have if this thing had 20 or 30 variants or was like really clever and it could do all of this different kind of stuff, it's going to be harder to find those things because components are searchable in your assets panel, right? If I go to the assets panel and I go to our collab kit that we have here, I can sort my components by the types of components that they are. I can also say, like, here's a good example, right? Like, there's a world where I could have made this feature card and this browse card part of the same component. And they could have just been variants. This could have been a variant called feature, and this could have been a variant called browse. But the trouble there is that then I can't search for those things in the assets panel. Like if I want to find the browse component, it needs to be its own component if I'm going to be able to find it. Or if I want to find the feature component, it needs to be its own component so I can find it over there too as well. If those are all the same thing, now I'm going to find myself over here in the panel trying to like select which, if it's feature or browse, and it's just a lot of work and it's a little bit harder to search for. So there's nothing wrong with breaking large components into smaller sets of components. It might feel a little bit redundant or maybe not as clever, but it also can be really valuable as a way to just keep things really organized and make it easier to align them. Even if the development team has them as one main component, it's okay because we have ways to connect these that they can be seen as the same component. So I would say optimize again for the experience of the designer who is going to be consuming and using these components inside of your designs. Oh, shouldn't delete the feature card though. That's probably not a good idea. Cool. Always be hydrating. Cool. And huge thank you to the other advocates who are in the chat. I know the chat is popping off, and so I really appreciate all the help with questions. Again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A. That is the place where we will make sure we answer some of those live, and we'll make sure you get answers to your questions there. Okay, so we talked a little bit about variables. We talked a little bit about styles, a little bit about components, some of the best practices, how to keep those things organized. Again, there is tons of great content out there for this type of stuff. I would definitely check it out. Let's talk a little bit about publishing your system, growing your system, and how to make sure that that's staying aligned with your goals and where you need to go with how you're building. So, as I mentioned, in Figma design, we have the concept of team libraries. Team libraries are how your design system is represented inside of Figma. Anytime you create a file like this, you can publish this as a team library. In this case, this file is actually our published library that we're looking at right now. I can click on this libraries, manage libraries modal right here. And this is going to show me that current library. And it actually has 4 changes inside of it. So I made there's some changes to some components that have been made. These haven't been published yet. I can go ahead and publish these. You'll see it's going to give you all the information as far as like how many variables you have, how many variants, things like that. Once you've made changes, you can actually publish those directly from your file, and then anyone using that file will receive a notification that they can pull in those updates. A couple of good things to know on publishing. Depending on the plan that you're on, if you're on, say, some of the higher plans that we have, organization and enterprise, things like that, you have the option to change the scope as to what you are publishing, where you are publishing. So basically, I can publish just to my team. I can publish this library to my entire workspace or to the actual entire organization that contains all the different workspaces and teams. This kind of scoping is really valuable for discoverability, right? If you're working with global libraries, you're going to want to publish them to your full organization. If you're working in a team, you may not want to expose that library to other teams. Now, they can still access your components if needed. Like if you gave an individual person access to your library, they can go ahead and they can use that. They can gain those. But this is more about discoverability, meaning who can find this library and actually add it to their designs. On top of this, there's a couple other really cool features that we can use. There's a concept of approved libraries. So if you are an admin and you have access to the resources panel, you'll see here that I'm actually able to see all of my libraries that I have, and I can set approved libraries. Approved libraries will always float to the top. Basically, they're always going to show up as the top library choices. This is really helpful for if you want to make sure that you're directing people to the right libraries that they need to use. And you can also set default libraries as well at the team level, workspace level. Basically, this means that these libraries will be on at all times. This is really, really valuable if your system is made up of multiple libraries. For example, let's come back here and let's actually look at our foundations library. So we've got two parts to our system. We've got our actual foundations. We've got a little bit, some components from another library file that are in there. I'm going to want both of these on at all times. That's where this resources panel can be really helpful because you're able to say, yes, I always want all four of these libraries to be turned on for every user or something like that, right? That's going to be really helpful for just ensuring that everyone has access to what they need access to. Another big part of libraries and growth and adoption of libraries is library analytics, right? So let's go ahead and see how we look at that. So basically back in your file here, if you go up to the library menu or the file menu up at the top, and you go to library, and we can go down to library analytics, you'll see here that we actually have our component data. So this is basically just telling us some introspective things about all of our components that we have. We can click on these, get a little bit of information about the components themselves, how many instances there are, and we start to get some of that analytics data. I'm actually gonna go back to a different view to show that right here. So here we can see the analytics of our library. How is our library being used? How is it being adopted? This is really, really valuable for when you're trying to prove the value of your design system, which I think is one of the harder things to do, right? You want to be able to show either that one library is getting adopted over another, or that you are just seeing general usage of your libraries. If you scroll down, you'll actually see it broken down to a component level. You can see it, you can compare two libraries together too, which is really, really useful. You can change your durations as well if you want to see these over longer time frames. This works for components, styles, and variables. So you can actually track all of that information in here. You'll see the top teams that are using them as well. So in this case, one of our other advocates, Anna, has actually been doing a fair amount of inserting of components or variables from this file here. And this is all really, really useful to help understand how your system is being used. Now, one thing to be aware of, I wouldn't expect this to always go up and to the right, like a graph that's just always getting better and better and better and better and better. You want that initial adoption, yes. This is a demo library, so ours is kind of moving up and down a little bit here, but that's actually pretty consistent with how I would imagine library usage is going to look long term. It's less of like a sales graph that's always going to go up, and it's more of a heartbeat. It's a health check, right? There's going to be times when your system's being used heavily, and there's going to be times when the system is probably not in as much use, and that should be okay, right? So you kind of have to reflect and ask yourself, what is the data showing me at this point in time? So just something to be aware of. Cool. You can also do really cool stuff with the analytics API and grab a bunch of data that you can get this from the CSV, but there's a really cool analytics API that will also give you lots of really cool data. We've seen some teams make some pretty cool graphs and correlation graphs and things like that for all of that data. That's more on the API side of things. Where do we access this again? Nishi, you can basically just go right to your any published library is going to have a library dropdown where you can basically go ahead and add that library analytics right there. Yeah, glad I could help. Cool. Okay. I know we're going a little fast, a little high level on all of this stuff, but again, there is tons of great content to get into this stuff deeper. Basically, just want to give you some high level perspective on ways you can start using this now. So let's talk a little bit about long-term contribution to your design system as well, right? So we've got our design system set up, we've got our team library, we've published it, we've got variants and styles and components, and it's getting use, and this is great. And you're going to come to that point in time when people are going to be like, okay, well, we want to improve this system. We want to add to this. Maybe we even only started with just the bare minimum that we knew we needed to get things off the ground. And now we want to start adding new components or changing components or getting rid of components that we don't need before. There's a few good approaches to this. And so I want to talk about a couple of them right now. Firstly, adding new components is real easy. You can just add new components. Just create new components inside of your file. Pretty straightforward. Publish them to the library. That's a great way to do it. Editing components, changing components. takes a little more consideration and something to be aware of. Let's say we have something like we'll go with our card component here, and we want to change the architecture of this component drastically, right? Like we want to actually remove entire fields or add entirely new fields and things like that. These can sometimes be called destructive changes, meaning that if you are actually deleting, like if I was to delete this text field here, anyone using this instance, if they've put in their own text to that component, I've now deleted that for them. I've destroyed it, right? So they don't actually have that text visible to them anymore inside those components. And you have to think about that kind of stuff when you're editing your design system elements and saying, okay, who is this going to affect downstream? Is anyone actively using this component? This is going to be a big issue. So adding things, generally okay. Removing things, take a consideration moment on that. And the way that I take that approach is like, if this is going to be really destructive, maybe it's best not to actually get rid of this component, but to create a secondary component as part of our design system and slowly phase out the original, right? So in that case, if I knew that our new browsing card was going to be wildly different, I will go ahead, create a second component. I'll probably call this something like 2.0 or whatever your versioning system may be in that case. And then from there, I will slowly start to phase out the initial component, meaning that I will keep both of them. We see a lot of teams doing this approach where basically both components will exist for a period of time. That period of time just depends on how active your design system is. That could be a few weeks if it's a small team, might be a few months or even longer if you're working with larger teams. But it ensures that people that were using the original version can close out their work, right? Like if they were already in the middle of a sprint and they're trying to publish something, this gives them an easy way to do that. From there, eventually, you'll probably want to just sort of leave some information in here, right? You can actually edit things like the component description and whatnot, and put in information, sort of like warning, this component's going to get deprecated at some point soon. So, or this is deprecated. Please don't use this anymore. We're going to remove this from the design system. Another fun trick that I like is you can actually give people a visual cue. So, like if you're certain that you're not going to use this component anymore, or you don't want people using it. There's an auto layout in here, so I'm just going to change some properties, have this ignore auto layout, and stretch to my corners and my sides. Great, left and right. Actually, let's go full left and right, full top and bottom. And I'll do stuff like this, where like, maybe I'll set this to a rather alarming color like that, right? And what's nice about that is that when they're back in their design files, let's see if I have an example of that component over here, maybe on my projects page. It's a slightly different version. Let me grab that. But like, what's nice about that is we'll go back to this, go to main component. Okay, so basically I was just in the wrong instance. It might be this one, might be this one. Doesn't matter. I'll just apply it to all of them. And if we publish that change, right? So if we just say publish our library changes, and I'm a designer and I'm back in my files and I'm trying to either find that component or use that new main component. Let's grab our updates. Okay, great, cool. We're gonna see like, oh, boy, I probably should stop using that component now. Or maybe if you're searching for that component, you're going to say, oh yeah, okay, that's probably not the component that I should be using. Perhaps there's a newer version of that. That's just one of the techniques. There's a lot of different ways to go about doing this too as well. Yes, Lara, great technique. Just putting something in the name of the component where it'll just say like XXX or something like that. So that can be helpful. The bigger point I'm trying to get at here is always back to that concept of like, think about the designer using this, right? Like if you were to just delete that component and get rid of it entirely, you're going to make someone's life really difficult if they're trying to put work out right now, right? So just think about how long you need to preserve things, how long before you can remove them. If you're doing a nice big V2, maybe that's a clear line to just say, yeah, okay, we're just going to get rid of that stuff we don't need anymore. Maybe we'll start a new library for that. You can easily move components to and from different libraries if they're published. You can cut and paste, right? Should have been a different session. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of what the session is here. We're building our aligned design systems, and we want to align with our other teams and make sure that we've got those elements in there. These are a lot of same techniques that developers are going to use as well, right? And so if you think about it, like you're going to hear developers using very similar things where they'll probably keep a legacy version of a component alive for longer. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the code side of things and how we actually keep that aligned. So far in our design system, we've been talking about how the designers can stay aligned within the design side of this, but where do we actually bring in code? Well, this is where Code Connect comes into play. Code Connect is a dev mode feature. Back to our design, we'll go back to our dashboard here, where we can actually connect the code from our real repositories of our design system directly to our designs inside of Figma. I'm going to switch into dev mode right now. So I'm going to hit Shift D on my keyboard. I'm now a dev mode user. Some users may only have access to dev mode, and this is what they're going to see. Dev mode will let you inspect the file, right? So if you want to actually see distances, measurements, values, any of those variables we were talking about earlier, or those styles that you've been using, any assets, if you need to be able to export assets, you can grab them these days as well. And that's all very useful information for when you're building things from scratch, or you're building things that maybe don't exist as in your development environment yet today in your code library. As the system begins to mature, especially on the code side, you're going to start having components, much like you do in design, where it's the repeatable pieces of code, right? This is a code component, which makes up your library of the components that you can use in code. That's kind of a one-to-one to what we have inside of Figma, where we have a search bar here. We're probably going to have a search bar in code. And at a very basic level, you can simply align them just by naming conventions, right? If you name the component the same thing in both places, that's fantastic. You're going to be able to at least have developers be aligned on like, oh, okay, I see the name of that component. That means it probably exists in our design system. I can probably go find it somewhere. Maybe we have it in Storybook. Maybe we have it in documentation. But Code Connect kind of takes that a step further and allows you to actually show that real code from your code repository. So what would happen is that a developer can set up this code connection. They can do this today basically by using like what's called a definitions file that sits inside your code repository. And it's going to point directly to this component inside of Figma. And once that connection has been created, now I'm actually able to see the real code from our code repository. In fact, if I click on this link right here, and I go over here, I actually happen to already have it open, but basically like we're using the simple, this is a version of the simple design system. And this is that exact search bar. Now, this piece of code looks much larger because what we're seeing here is the actual code it takes to render all of this. But to actually use this component, it's actually a much smaller piece of code where all we have to do is see basically just the actual component information. So if I was to actually go and look at the Figma version of this, if I go into Figma and I go into primitives and I go to search, this is really just the piece that Figma needs. And that's what we're seeing rendered over here inside of dev mode, because that's all you need to basically paste to get that information to show up when you actually render the React code in this case. We support a lot of different library types. React is the one that I have set up here today, but you can do this with web components. You can do this with a number of other common frameworks too as well. Again, talk to your developers about this kind of stuff. Bring them into this discussion. If you have maybe a design systems cohort or at least one or two people who are focused on helping to be involved in design systems, talk to them because this is going to be the connection point for them as well. So you'll see here, we've got the actual code. We've got that search text that's actually showing up. So it's bringing in our props. Now, if you want to, your code components may look different than your design components, and that's okay, right? Building things with layers in design is very different than building things with code. But again, your developers should be able to, if they check out the documentation, you can see we're doing some translation of how things look in Figma to how they should actually look in code. You can have one component in code mapped to multiple components inside of design. You can have multiple design components mapped to one in code. There's a lot of real possibility here. There was a great session that happened, I think about 3 weeks ago. It's on our YouTube channel now about how to set up Code Connect. And again, we have a lot of more content coming this week for developers, not this week, sorry, this quarter for developers to do this. And yes, Amir, there is tons of documentation. If you just Google Figma Code Connect, you're going to get all the documentation that you need. There are docs on our website, on the Help Center, that will walk through how to set this up, the different integration guides for different libraries, so Swift, Webpack, Jetpack. Sorry, not Webpack, Web Components, Jetpack. If you already have Storybook, there's an even quicker integration, which is really nice. And then on top of that, there are GitHub repositories with examples of all of this as well. So you can go in and follow the instructions here. It's pretty straightforward. I don't consider myself a good developer, and I was able to follow this information. So definitely go and check it out. This piece that we're talking about here is really important. This is probably the most important part of aligning your design systems to code that I can mention. And from a designer's perspective, this is what's going to help you with MCP and agentic coding. We're going to talk about this more in future sessions. This isn't going to be an MCP session, but what it is that this is really important for developers. It's even more important for agentic coding tools that are trying to understand how your design system is connected together. And so once you have all of this in place, connecting the code to your design elements, that is where agentic coding tools can actually read that information in the same way through Figma's MCP server. And so you're actually able to provide all that context and tell the LLM exactly what components it needs, where they're located, what they look like. And that's the real value that we want to bring to our development partners, is being able to have designs that very clearly say exactly what components they're using and where they can find them and what is the information that they need to build that directly inside of Figma. Okay, that was a lot of different content that we have today, lots of different areas. Just a quick recap, and we're going to get some Q&A right now too as well. What I want to do is share with you all just a couple of quick notes that we're going to talk about. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here to some of our pieces on, again, why these matter, right? So because we want to be able to reduce work, have consistency in our design system, and stay aligned with our development partners. Focus on the foundations. The foundations are key. You have to build on top of the foundations in order to find success with this stuff. We want variables and styles and components to be in place so that our developers can connect those to our coded components, so we can take advantage of that both from a development side and with AI. Publishing and growing your system, keeping an eye on the health of that system is really important. And again, yeah, lastly, those connection points are going to become more and more valuable. If you're just getting into the space of Code Connect and AI, please check this stuff out. It's fantastic. Let's get into some Q&A.
We have a lot of Q&A.
Fantastic. I think we can go a little long today, so we'll be okay. We'll answer as many questions as we can. If we don't get to them, please find me online. I'm happy to talk more about all of this stuff too.
Yeah, we will get back to a bunch of the questions because there are a lot of questions. And, you know, I will say people have certainly asked some questions at depth today.
Great.
So maybe we just go back to trying to sum up some of these questions. And, you know, Anthony, what advice would you really kind of give around what are those effective strategies for naming Figma variables to look to how do we resolve the conflict between that, you know, the elements of design and readability and the need for reliable automated transformation into multiple code formats?
Yeah. That is a big question.
I know it's a big question.
All right. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
One thing I'm going to share, and this is a fantastic article, Nathan Curtis, variables. There is a couple of great articles out here by Nathan Curtis that I highly recommend. Let's go with token naming. I think he calls them tokens. Yep, naming tokens in design systems. I will drop this in. This is a fantastic article that will walk you through a number of details. Nathan does incredible work in the design systems community, has spoken at Config and at our other conferences, Schema as well. This will talk through some of the high level sort of thought processes behind that, right? Best practices wise, I would just say the two most important things. One, get as aligned with your development partner as possible. As much overlap as you can have in variable names, the better. If they're prefixing because of it's the name of your system, maybe prefixing your variables makes sense, right? If they're using kebab case or camel case or anything like that, one of the ways that you can name these things, try to align. The earlier you align, that's less translation you have to do later, right? So that's kind of the key elements there. As far as the translation, if you do need to change the names of them, you can do a little inside of Figma with the thing that we looked at today, the changing the syntax. Alternatively, maybe the developers need to have a translation layer in place that can actually convert that either through some sort of JSON translation or just some way to actually get the values that they need out of those naming conventions. But most importantly, the earlier upstream you're aligned, the less work you have to do downstream to try and realign.
Yeah. Building on that, I guess, any advice for people who are looking at, yes, we get alignment early in the process, but how do we kind of maintain that alignment and keep things in sync over time?
Great question. So how do we stay aligned over time? The best word that I have here is debug. I love this word because debug, much like you're going to debug software or even debug your designs, you need to debug your processes. You need to be thinking about this regularly. It doesn't need to be overburdened and you're doing it every single day, but set some regular cadences, whether that's team syncs or forums where more people can be involved and ask questions. Again, the size of your organization is going to matter here, right? Or the size of your team that you're working with, whether that's biweekly or monthly or quarterly. I'm going to say, well, I'll make sure to include this in the email that goes out, but we have some great talks from Config that talk about this kind of stuff and exactly like how and when you want to do those sorts of things. But alignment comes down to communication. The system is not there to replace communication. It's there to elevate communication, right? It's there to support it. So you need to continue to talk to your development partners and talk to those teams.
Fabulous. Just going back over that whole feed, so many questions in there to kind of pull out and answer. I'm actually going to throw it to you, Anthony. Anthony, any that you want to really pick out of that feed and say, hey, this is one that we should really cover. There's a couple there asking about from a dev point of view, how do we export the variables? There's a couple looking for any of the plugins that you might recommend that will really augment people in managing things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's talk about those two. I'm going to start with the question around like, how do you make sure that this is a little bit more of a developer question, but like, how do we make sure that MCP is picking up the right information about our code base? This is where you need to make sure that MCP has access to, you need to make sure that your LLM is accurately reading your code base first, right? So whatever LLM tool that you're using, whether that's GitHub Copilot, Cursor, Windsurf, anything like that, make sure, and you can ask it some of those introspective questions too, like make sure it's accurately able to locate your current variables. Because remember, those need to be in the code as well. You can have them inside a Figma design, but it's not going to generate those variables for you automatically in that context. It needs to be able to read them from Figma and then locate variables with the same names inside of your code base. So that's the key element there. There is the variables REST API, which can also be really helpful for syncing your variables to a code base. There's also some great plugins for exporting your variables if you need them in various formats, whether that's JSON or the token format. I'm going to mess up the name, DTMF format, I believe. And you can get those right out of Figma and put them into your code base. But remember, it has to be on that code base side. And then you're going to need that connection in variables names between the two, either because you've set the syntax. You could even have an instructions file that does its best to try and if there's similarities in the names, you could try and explain, hey, I need you to match these, fuzzy match these. Success there, maybe your mileage might vary. So I would just try out some of those techniques, but that's the real piece there. Second one, plugins. Two major plugins I want to talk about that are really important that I use quite a bit. Design System Organizer. This is a fantastic plugin that will let you organize layers, organize all different types of groupings and ungrouping and grouping variables and styles and things like that. Really, really useful. I'll drop these into the chat while I'm at it. There you go. And then next one is also variables and styles organizer. Sorry, not organizer. Styles and variables organizer. Very similar name, very different plugin. This one can do some interesting stuff where it will actually scan your files and it will find things that are not attached correctly. So if you have values that were not set to variables, you can go ahead and actually do a merge and combine those things together. Or if you have variables that are the same, but they don't need to be for some reason, or it's just, you want to identify areas where you're like, do we just have a lot of overlap for no reason or something like that? You can go ahead and do that too as well here. So those two are big ones. Import export is another big one, only because our native feature is still in the works, but this is a quick way to get variables in and out of Figma. So Variables Pro is a great one, swapping, importing, and exporting. I'm going to make a note, just be careful with swapping. If you do anything swapping of variables, please test it on a small set of variables before you do it on your entire library. You always have version history. You can always go back, but just something to try out. If you're making a big change that's going to affect a lot of people downstream, always test it on a small subset first.
Fabulous. Thank you, Anthony. I am going to have to say we are at time. Hopefully that was really a valuable session for everybody who joined us online. Thank you for joining us online. please absolutely come in and check out figma.com/events for any future live streams. If you've got any suggestions or ideas, reach out to us on community@figma.com. For those of you, we are very sorry we didn't get to answer all of the questions live or as we went through the session today. We will try and get some answers out to you post the live stream today.
Yeah.
So with that, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a fabulous session, and we'll see you at the next one.
Yeah. And if you want to reach out to me, that's my Twitter, Reddit, all my social handles. So feel free to reach out. Pretty easy to find too as well.